Okay, this is my fourth and hopefully final draft of my open letter to Soka University of America and to Soka Gakkai International USA, or SGI-USA. And this is the fourth draft. I haven't yet typed it up because all my computers don't work, but you can see it's written in pencil, so it's kind of hard to read, so I got the light here. Okay, dear SGI-USA leaders and members and SUA alumni, students, faculty, and staff, I have wanted to write this letter sooner, but due to a tragic event which has happened at my alma mater in April of 2025, I feel I can wait no longer in addressing this very important and timely issue. In Daisaku Ikeda's published dialogue with futurist Hazel Henderson, he writes, Though most religions stipulate a prohibition against lying, quote, Buddhism goes one step further than forbidding lying by requiring us to speak the truth, end quote. That's from page 40 of the dialogue. I hope the truths I write in this letter don't grate too harshly at the ears. I have been a very strong and consistent member of the SGI-USA since about 1980, when I graduated from the Junior Pioneers, which was the former name of the Future Division, and joined the brass band. I also attended SUA, or Soka University of America, from 2001 to 2005, and graduated with honors from the first graduating class of 2005. I have read more books written by Daisaku Ikeda than any other author, though I have been a very avid reader of many other subjects since my teenage years. What I admired most about Daisaku Ikeda's books, dialogues, and lectures is his consistency in pointing out the great dangers in authoritarianism and the danger and folly of following those who claim to be authorities. In 2020, when SGI-USA and SUA decided to blindly go along with the false narratives of unelected and corrupt so-called health bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., and known criminals in Davos, in their extremely authoritarian and unconstitutional mandates to stop law-abiding people from peacefully assembling, which is our U.S. constitutional First Amendment right. I was extremely disheartened. Despite President Ikeda's lifelong promotion of dialogue, the leaders of the SGI-USA and administrators of SUA decided to blindly go along with these extremely draconian and very unconstitutional mandates, this all without any dialogue with SGI-USA frontline leaders or with SUA alumni. But instead, SGI-USA shuttered indefinitely all community centers and banned all members from gathering in person for Buddhist activities. In addition, SUA closed its campus and moved classes to online classes. At the time, I was a district men's division leader in San Diego, California, and until then, we had very dynamic meetings about 3 times a month in the living room of my apartment in Normal Heights, San Diego. Living alone as I did at the time, I looked forward 3 times a month to having a reason to clean my apartment and have sometimes up to 30 people joyously gather to study and practice Buddhism and have dialogues about the practice and our lives. The mystic thing about my apartment at the time is when I was first touring the apartment, I learned from the young lady giving me the tour that this apartment, number 7, like the 7 characters of the Daimoku, Namu, Myoho Renge Kyo, used to be where they previously had SGI meetings for North Park District. Therefore, when I moved in, the former home of North Park District, it once again became the meeting place for North Park District. In the late 1980s, during my teenage years, I read 3 of the published dialogues of President Ikeda in succession. Those 3 dialogues were Man Himself Must Choose, which later got renamed Choose Life, which was a dialogue with historian Arnold Toynbee. The next dialogue, Dawn After Dark, with art critic Rene Huguet. And the third dialogue, Before It's Too Late, with founder of Club of Rome, Aurelio Pesci. These 3 books caused me in high school to have this awakening that made me become completely aware that everything being portrayed on the mainstream media was based on completely debunked and erroneous information that was designed to propagandize you into believing false narratives that benefited the oligarchs that owned it and their talking heads in government. Therefore, in my senior year in high school, 1989, I completely stopped watching all television and instead read books voraciously to find out what the truths are that these so-called news outlets were trying to hide from people. Therefore, when the so-called pandemic hit, I could see clearly that if both the so-called left and the so-called right media and both wings of the corporate duopoly in Washington were all in lockstep promoting the very counterproductive and extremely unhealthy countermeasures, that this was a psychological operation or psyops. After witnessing over 30 years that these same media outlets and criminal politicians had lied repeatedly about every war from Yugoslavia to Afghanistan and beyond, and that they covered up major crimes like Whitewater, the Franklin scandal, Enron, September 11th, and what pizza and hot dogs referred to in certain politicians' emails, I knew I could never trust anything these shills reported on. Did the leaders of SGI-USA and the administrators at SUA somehow believe that all of a sudden these corrupt quote-unquote news outlets and bought-off politicians, for the first time in reality, somehow cared about the average person's health and safety? If any of them bothered to read any of my published books, all of which I donated to the SUA library in about 2007, which never got put into general circulation, they would not have been fooled by this fully rehearsed and orchestrated misanthropic COVID coup. In the first volume of my selected writings from Soka University of America, I detailed the extreme corruption in all U.S. corporate media. In volume 2 of my selected writings from Soka University of America, both of which got republished in my collected writings of Soka University of America, in one big volume of 1,000 pages, I detailed the corruption of the pharmaceutical industry, the pharmaceutical industrial complex in the U.S. Even before the lockdowns, I knew full well when they started taking down all my health videos, which had been up on my YouTube channel for over 7 years before the scamdemic, that this was a gigantic worldwide psychological operation or psyops that had nothing whatsoever to do with the pre-patented lab-created virus called SARS-CoV-2. One of my videos, which is still awaiting review by YouTube, since 2019 is about what NASA calls the universal antidote, also known as chlorine dioxide or MMS, miracle mineral solution, which I knew since 2010 gets rid of all viral infections, all pathogenic infections, all fungal infections, and all bacterial infections. There were thousands of videos about this amazing product all over YouTube from 2010 to 2019, but then all of a sudden, before anyone even knew there had been a so-called outbreak of a respiratory virus in China, all of a sudden these videos, including my own, were all flagged as, quote, medical misinformation, end quote, and taken down from YouTube. So when I started getting reports from my friends in Japan about, quote unquote, COVID, way before any U.S. media was yet talking about it, I immediately posted on my Facebook videos doctors in Asia who had been successful fighting SARS-1 in 2003 and how they beat it by creating sauna-like conditions by boiling water and blowing the steam into the nasal cavity with a blow dryer. And those got deleted from Facebook in 2019 for, quote, medical misinformation. I had been on Facebook since 2007, and I had posted hundreds of natural healing videos, and I never had any of them taken down until 2019. So I knew that when both YouTube and Facebook, both companies, received seed money in their initial creation from In-Q-Tel, which is the CIA investment firm, that this was a deep state military operation. So, from that point on, I didn't buy into any of the quote-unquote fear porn that SGI-USA leaders were using to justify the shutdown and suspension of the whole Kosen-Rufu movement, and SUA was using to stifle Soka education. How many worse diseases were ravaging Japan in the Daishonen's time, and never once in any of his thousands of writings did he ever write, you should lock yourself indoors and stop going out in public and let the rich monopolists destroy your businesses while they profited hand over fist. How could any Buddhist discourage the community of believers, or the Sangha, which is the third of the three treasures in Buddhism, from communing from continuing to commune with each other? The worst part about this tragedy is the SGI-USA leadership did this unconscionable, un-Buddhist, and very unconstitutional act without any prior consultation with district leaders, who I've been told by President Ikeda since at least the early 1990s, when I was a district YMD leader, and I was invited to a special meeting at the World Cultural Center with President Ikeda, that only district leaders were invited to, that we were the most important leaders in the organization. Did no other high-up leader ever read the guidance President Ikeda gave at that meeting in LA? Or did they just somehow forget in all the orchestrated media hype and commotion? Instead, did some pencil pushers in LA or elsewhere just decide to close down the whole organization and all its facilities on their own? So much for dialogue. So for this whole 2+ years of unconstitutional shutdown, I decided instead to turn North Park District home in Normal Heights into the live studio of a new live podcast called Live from Normal Heights. At least once or twice a month, I had anywhere from 2 to 20 people meet, unmasked, and without any social distancing nonsense, in our former district home. We discussed the pandemic and all of its crimes and injustices, and what we were doing personally to counter it. I worked 7 days a week and all holidays throughout the entire pandemic, delivering groceries for Whole Foods and Amazon Fresh Groceries. On my deliveries all over San Diego County, I ran into so many active young people and old people who were all defying the unconstitutional house arrest orders. These singers, songwriters, activists, rappers, painters, actors, directors, and other artists were all out among the community, not following any of the propaganda of the high priest of scientism, the known criminal Anthony Fauci. We did our podcast live on Facebook and Instagram, and then uploaded them to YouTube. Eventually, at about episode 30, on September 19th, 2021, with absolutely no explanation or chance to review why, all my accounts on Instagram and Facebook were taken down, and I was completely kicked off of both platforms. However, all 30 plus episodes of this podcast can still be seen on my highly shadow banned YouTube channel. This is truly the standalone spirit that my mentor, Daisaku Ikeda, has taught me ever since my mom joined NSA, formerly called the former name of the SGI-USA, since 1992, when I was 11 months old. And of course, none of the over 100 people who came to my apartment for the live broadcasts ever got sick, even though only one person ever wore a mask because she worked for the government and she feared retaliation from her employers. But just like all the bought-off politicians and talking heads who appeared on the Brought to You by Pfizer media circus, when the cameras turned off, they all took off their masks and disregarded the whole charade of social distancing. I'm sure if I would have been allowed by SGI-USA to continue having our North Park District meetings, most likely the same thing would have happened. As the current HHS Human Health Services Secretary repeatedly said, quote, "The framers of the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights purposely put no exemption in these two documents for pandemics, as they had far worse and more deadly outbreaks of disease in their time than the completely overhyped COVID scare," end quote. I reached out to all the youth of San Diego who were all immune to all the COVID misinformation and disinformation pushed by the Brought to You by Pfizer corporate media shills, who falsely claimed to be bringing people the news, which was nothing but fear porn to push unconstitutional policies of human control, which had absolutely nothing to do with public health or safety. I would often write on my Facebook page during this whole human fabricated fiasco, which I rightly called both a scamdemic and a plandemic, quote, "Faith is to fear nothing, to stand unswayed, the power to surmount any obstacles. Faith is the source of all solutions, the mighty ship needed to cross the sea of sufferings." This quote is from Daisaku Ikeda's poem to my young American friends that he wrote to us in the 1970s when I was in the Junior Pioneers. Nowhere in this amazing poem did President Ikeda say, quote, "Fear nothing but a laboratory-created virus, and stay locked in your homes, and stop doing Kozen-Rufu until the talking heads on TV tell you it's safe to go back out and start living your life again." I was able to introduce more people to my Buddhist practice than all the members who were blindly following these unconstitutional mandates to stay on house arrest. President Ikeda wrote, quote, "Quite simply, there can be no true democracy unless the citizens of a country realize that they are sovereign, that they are the main protagonists, and then, with wisdom and a strong sense of responsibility, take action based on that realization. Democracy cannot be successful in its mission unless the people rouse themselves to become more informed and involved, unless they unite, unless they establish an unshakable force for justice and keep a strict eye on the activities of the powerful," end quote. That's from April 13th, from today and tomorrow, the daily encouragements. So who were the quote-unquote powerful who we were supposed to, quote, keep a strict eye on, end quote, that President Ikeda writes about during the COVID coup? The high priest of scientism, Anthony Fauci, as Robert F. Kennedy Jr. so eloquently details in his best-selling book, The Real Anthony Fauci, Bill Gates, Big Pharma, and the Global War on Democracy and Public Health. This Fauci has had a long, deadly career of abuse of science and medicine to line him and his minions' pockets at the expense of hundreds of thousands of humans and animals' lives. Just during the laboratory-created HIV/AIDS pandemic alone, Fauci killed more people than any other doctor in history, including Shido Ishii in Japan and Joseph Mengele. Bill Gates, who profited more from his Pfizer-BioNTech stock than any other individual during the COVID coup, who many aware people call quote-unquote kill Gates, due to the incredible increase in death rates everywhere he goes with his deadly vaccines schemes. He is someone every Buddhist who cares about the future of humanity should keep a watchful eye on. In one Danish study of 2017, the study is Morgensen et al. This study shows that Mr. Gates, with the DTP vaccine, killed 4 people for every 1 person he supposedly saved in Africa. Is there any wonder why he started the Bill and Melinda Gates Institute for Population and Reproductive Health? So what does Mr. Gates want to do to the population? He has stated publicly that with his quote-unquote vaccine programs, quote, "if we do a good job," end quote, we can reduce the population by 10 to 15%. In the Danish study on Bill Gates' African DTP vaccine scheme, he was using a vaccine which had already been pulled from the market for its extremely unsafeness in all developed countries. But for incredible profits, Bill Gates pushed this deadly product on so many African countries and fraudulently called his deadly vaccine schemes philanthropy. There is absolutely nothing philanthropic that Bill Gates a known eugenicist and monopolist, has ever done anywhere around the world. However, he has pumped millions and sometimes billions of dollars into corrupt media outlets and the World Health Organization and governments around the world to do fluff pieces that fraudulently show him as a philanthropist. He is definitely not at all a philanthropist. His humanicidal projects around the world show that he is actually a misanthropist or hater of humanity. And anyone who cares about the future of human life should be opposed to everything he does. How could anyone who has been reading Daisaku Ikeda's guidance, who is a leader in the SGI-USA or who is administering SUA, not see through the quote-unquote activities of the powerful, end quote, that Daisaku Ikeda speaks about in the aforementioned guidance, when it was so blatantly obvious if you've kept an eye on any of their crimes for at least the past few decades. There was absolutely nothing the U.S. government nor its so-called health agencies nor the World Health Organization, WHO, did during the whole 2+ years of the scamdemic that had anything to do whatsoever with public health and or with human safety. Everything they did, as they rehearsed over and over for decades or more in their military pandemic simulations, was to clamp down on human freedoms and supplant democratic institutions with totalitarian and authoritarian controls and censorship of free speech, free movement, and bodily autonomy, and the destruction of people's lives and living and the stealing of their property. How could anyone in the SGI-USA or at SUA be so blind to this? It was so obvious to anyone who wasn't listening to and or watching the trauma-based mind control that they tried to pass as quote-unquote news on the brought to you by Pfizer media circus. All anyone has to do is ask any AI program, how many felony convictions does Pfizer have over the last 30 years? And you will see that this very criminal company should not be allowed to advertise anywhere. During the first SARS so-called outbreak of 2003, I was studying at SUA in my sophomore or junior year. But I knew at the time from reading the works of and or listening to the lectures of famous whistleblower and best-selling author Dr. Leonard Horowitz, that like AIDS and HIV, anthrax and Ebola, that SARS was a bioweapon purposely released from a military bioweapons lab. The quote-unquote vaccine for SARS-1 was, like the so-called COVID vaccine, far more deadly than the disease itself. In his best-selling book, Emerging Viruses, AIDS and Ebola, Natural, Accidental, or Intentional, Dr. Horowitz details how AIDS-HIV was created in a Bethesda, Maryland laboratory by Dr. Robert Gallo under contracts with Lytton Bionetics. This same doctor, who was falsely credited for quote-unquote discovering HIV, was actually the criminal who invented it. Horowitz also shows that Africans, African Americans, and gay people were all purposely targeted with this new bioweapon, and even worse, Dr. Fauci used a known deadly so-called medicine AZT to kill the great majority of victims who supposedly died from AIDS or HIV. This was the exact same strategy Dr. Fauci perfected during the AIDS epidemic to now use on all populations during the COVID coup. The known faulty PCR tests that are known to give more false positives than true cases that they used with supposed AIDS victims was again used to create massive fear, which caused people who were asymptomatic to take deadly AZT, just like he pushed the deadly remdesivir during the COVID coup. To me, the greatest crime SGI-USA members and people associated with my alma mater, SUA, should be concerned with concerning this whole pandemic is not only did SGI-USA and SUA go along with the fascist and unconstitutional mandates, but once the U.S. government shoddily tested and falsely licensed the deadly bioweapon fictitiously called a vaccine and illegally pushed it on the public, the SGI-USA pushed it on all of its members, including their children, who had absolutely no risk of dying from this flu. In addition, SUA pushed it on all their students, faculty, and staff. They wanted us to blindly inject a very risky experimental quote-unquote medicinal product into our volitional bodies, even people like me who were smart enough to go out and get natural immunity. I went out during the whole COVID coup to actively try to catch COVID because I knew, like I did with chickenpox and the measles in the 70s, that natural immunity is far more advantageous than destroying your immune system with some genetically engineered experimental quote-unquote medical procedure. I knew with natural immunity that I would be protected for life. I saw through all the lies of the quote-unquote brought to you by Pfizer, criminal corporation Pfizer, so-called media, that people were dying in droves from COVID. They were only dying if they went to big hospitals of doctors who were following Dr. Fauci's known deadly protocols. Hospitals were massively financially incentivized to murder people and claim they died from COVID. People who went to doctors who didn't follow Dr. Fauci's deadly protocols, but instead treated them with medicines like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, which the brought to you by Pfizer media were falsely stigmatizing, they didn't have any of their patients die. But if they went to a hospital, they were administering the deadly remdesivir. If they first couldn't kill them with intubation, these hospitals were making millions of dollars harvesting the organs of people who wouldn't have died if they had not gone to a hospital. Nurses and doctors who started to wake up to what was going on started calling Dr. Fauci's deadly cocktail remdesivir. They called it "Run, Death is Near." Hospitals were incentivized by up to 5 times the normal reimbursements if they could get one false positive PCR test to claim they died of COVID. On top of this, everyone who went to a hospital for any reason, even if they had no symptoms of COVID, were daily retested until they could get one false positive PCR test. The lie of asymptomatic carriers that Fauci used to murder people with AZT during the AIDS HIV scare, he used again during COVID to murder people who really didn't have COVID with remdesivir, otherwise known as remdesivir. Since I studied diseases for many years before the COVID coup, I knew that all viruses mutate over time to become less deadly. Therefore, I went out and purposely caught it during the so-called deadliest strain, the Delta wave, so I could cause the virus to mutate to a less deadly strain. Thanks to me and other courageous people who refused to stay on unconstitutional house arrest, we brought an end to the laboratory-created virus. So for us, who put our lives on the line to put an end to the COVID coup, to think that now we would take part in a very dangerous medical experiment when we already survived the worst wave of the flu and therefore already had natural immunity was just absolute insanity. But the SGI-USA leaders who were pushing this experimental medical procedure on all members and their children, and whomever at SUA was doing likewise, did not seem to know that they were not only illegally practicing medicine without a license, but they were violating the Nuremberg Charter against medical experimentation without informed consent. For someone like me who spent 4 years of my life from age 30 to age 35 studying human rights and humanitarian conventions at SUA, I was equally appalled that the campus of my alma mater was used during the COVID coup to medically experiment on almost 300,000 people, all without any informed consent. Therefore, I tried to have a dialogue with one of the lawyers of SUA. This person was one of my favorite leaders in the SGI-USA when in 1989 I was the San Diego, LA Territory No. 5 Young Lions Territory leader. And when I was a YMD group leader in Orange County, a YMD district leader in Orange County, a YMD chapter leader in Orange County, a YMD area leader in Orange County, and eventually a YMD vice regional leader in Orange County before I went to SUA. This leader who came to visit me in a Compton hospital when I flipped my car on the freeway coming back from a youth meeting at the World Culture Center in 1996 was someone I always greatly looked up to. I recall many times in the 1980s and 90s when I would be doing SOCA group, which was called TCD, Traffic Control District, on a street corner far away from some big NSA convention, just in case some member got lost and couldn't find the performance site. He would say things to me like, being behind the scenes is far better and more honorable than being in the limelight. This is where Sensei's true disciples are, end quote. To which I totally agree. It was because I respected this leader so much, and that now he was a lawyer for SUA, that I tried to have a dialogue with him about the legal ramifications of what SGI-USA, and more importantly, what SUA had done during the COVID coup. I told this lawyer and longtime friend that the medical experimentation that was conducted on about 300,000 people on SUA's campus was not only illegal, but they went against the Nuremberg Charter. But shockingly, he didn't want to listen to my concerns. He said he's, quote, not into vaccine conspiracies, end quote, and, quote, the organization has people that love Trump and those who don't. Who cares, end quote. As if the crimes that were committed at SUA were somehow to do with which wing of the corporate duopoly that you subscribe to. He was supposed to be giving sound legal advice to my alma mater, and he was acting like my concerns had something to do with whether I voted for the donkey or the elephant party, which has nothing to do with this matter. For those who are not aware of the Nuremberg Convention Charter, to which the U.S. government and most other governments are a signatory to, nor the laws in the U.S. prohibiting medical experimentation to anyone without informed consent, let me detail it to you the way I tried to detail it to this SUA lawyer, who didn't at all seem to be concerned that Soka University of America was violating international humanitarian conventions at a school which the founder, Daisaku Ikeda, had originally proposed to be called the University of Human Rights. The founder would be rolling in his grave now if he hadn't been cremated. There are two main aspects to informed consent. First, you have to inform the human test subjects before you administer the experimental medical procedure on them of A, all the known risks, and B, all the known benefits of the experimental medical procedure. Second, you can't allow anyone to take part in the medical experimentation if they have been subjected to either A, undue influence, or B, undue coercion. When the government gave the COVID vaccine emergency use authorization, EUA, it was listed legally as an IND, or investigational new drug, which means whenever it is administered, it is considered a medical experiment, which means it requires full informed consent. Therefore, before any doctor, nurse, or any other medical professional administers it, they need to either give the test subjects a brochure listing all the supposed benefits and all the possible side effects, or they need to tell them verbally all those things. After that, they must have the test subject sign a consent form that acknowledges that they are participating in this medical experiment of their own volition and that they haven't been subjected to any undue influence or any undue coercion. Undue influence is any positive incentive, like SGI-USA saying, if you subject yourself to this medical experiment, we will now let you finally come to an in-person meeting. In addition, when some donut shop says, if you take this shot, we will give you some free donuts. We saw all kinds of fast food joints giving away meals and other incentives to influence people into taking this very risky product. In every case, the persons who were administering this medical experiment were doing so unlawfully because they didn't ask anyone if they were being incentivized. Now, let's look at undue coercion. This is any negative incentive, such as SUA saying to students, if they don't donate their healthy bodies, to mad scientists and take part in this dangerous medical experiment, they can no longer be students at SUA. Or if they are teachers who refuse to be medically experimented on, they can no longer teach at SUA. All this made it illegal for anyone under U.S. law and or under the Nuremberg Convention Charter to conduct these experiments. To make matters worse, the FDA tried to block FOIA, or Freedom of Information Act, requests for all the Pfizer trial data that Pfizer had submitted to the FDA for its initial Emergency Use Authorization, or EUA. The FDA tried to keep this data from the public for 75 years. Therefore, until they finally lost the court cases and all the files were ordered released, no medical professional was privy to all the incredible side effects of this very deadly product. Therefore, there was absolutely no way they could have given any participant in this medical experiment any informed consent. To add even more insult to injury, the criminal high priest of scientism, Anthony Fauci, went on the Brought to You by Pfizer media and blatantly lied that this medical experiment was, quote, 100% safe and effective, end quote. And then the President of the United States, Joe Biden, repeated this same lie, 100% safe and effective, end quote. And finally, that darling of the deep state, Rachel Mockingbird Maddow, went on the Brought to You by Pfizer media that she shills for and repeated this lie for the third time, claiming if you get vaccinated, you will be unable to spread the disease, which no credible study ever showed. I knew after these three buffoons went on TV that all three of them were lying through their teeth, because effective is not a medical term. I knew that if they weren't all three lying, they would have used the medical term efficacious. We only learned the efficaciousness of this very dangerous medical experiment when the group Public Health and Medical Professionals for Transparency got a federal judge to honor their FOIA, Freedom of Information request, and the first batch of 50,000 documents were released to the public in November of 2021. By then, almost 7 billion COVID-19 vaccine doses had been administered globally, all illegally. We learned from the Pfizer documents that, in fact, the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine had about a 400% negative efficacy rate, which meant, like Bill Gates' deadly medical debaucheries in Africa, you had to kill 4 people in order to save one person's life. If any medical professional who administered this deadly bioweapon to almost 300,000 people at SUA were to have given proper legal informed consent, they would have had to tell all 300,000 victims of this very tragic medical experiment that they would be 4 times more likely to die if they took this jab than if they just caught COVID naturally like I did. And the likelihood that any young student would die after naturally contracting COVID was less than 0.1%. They were more likely to die of a coyote bite if they walked down the back of the mountain from SUA campus, something I often did when I was a student at SUA in 2001 to 2005. But no one has ever freaked out and put up fences around SUA campus to keep coyotes from biting students, because the prospect of such an incident is, like a student dying of COVID, so extremely remote. On top of the COVID jab having a 400% negative efficacy, as the president of International Developed Markets at Pfizer admitted to the European Union Parliament on October 10th, 2022, sheepishly, "Oh no, we never tested the vaccine to see if it would stop transmission," end quote. Because, as she foolishly said, "we were working at the speed of science," end quote. Sounds like a song from the 80s. Okay, that's the wrong one. Therefore, they had to change the definition of a vaccine to include a product that doesn't stop the spread, but something that, quote, reduces your likelihood of getting severely sick or hospitalized, end quote. This statement is nothing but a sales gimmick, because there has never been a respectable study that shows it to be true. So this product should have never been called a vaccine, because it does nothing that a real vaccine is supposed to do. One of the main inventors of the mRNA platform, Dr. Robert Malone, says, quote, "It is not a vaccine. It is a gene therapy," end quote. As it turns out, all the people I know who, like me, contracted COVID naturally never got it again unless they lived with someone who recently got vaccinated, because this so-called vaccine sheds, which means you can get all the poisonous mRNA and lipid nanoparticle and spike protein and other deadly ingredients in this bioweapon by being in close contact with anyone who has recently been jabbed, especially if you have sex with them. Everyone I know who took the jab have gotten COVID a number of times since being quote-unquote vaccinated. Most people I know who took part in this tragic medical experiment now have all kinds of health problems that they never experienced pre-vaccination. This is why in the Nuremberg trial after World War II, the doctors who experimented on people without their informed consent were hung to death. And this is why almost all nations agreed to never do it again, until, of course, all scientific rationalism and all moral reasoning was thrown out the door during the COVID coup. And what were the known risks of taking part in this groupthink mass formation psychosis? If anyone bothered to read the Pfizer trial documents, which have so far been published in 2 gigantic books by Dr. Naomi Wolf et al., subtitled Pfizer's Crimes Against Humanity, you will see Pfizer and the FDA knew very well before these concoctions were released on the public that they would cause cancers to skyrocket. They also knew that miscarriages would drastically increase. In some of the Pfizer trials, they recorded that the breast milk of mothers were turning a metallic blue. Additionally, they knew it would cause heart problems to many people, especially young men. Also, they knew that after the shot, it would be much more difficult for women to get pregnant. I'm sure I'm not the only person in SGI-USA who refused to take part in this dangerous medical experiment. In fact, over 70,000 doctors, nurses, and medical professionals in New York City alone were willing to be fired because they refused to be guinea pigs of their own industry. But unfortunately, many people were not as wise and or as informed as I was. One of them, Lucas Colombo from SUA's class of 2027, was a 20-something-year-old from Brazil who had a heart condition before he attended SUA. He should have been told that these shots shouldn't be taken by young men who already have heart problems. He unfortunately passed away while attending SUA on April 25th, 2025. It was because of his unfortunate and tragic death that I finally had the courage to take the time to write this long overdue letter. Daisaku Ikeda often said and wrote that at times of crises, the true character of a person will come to the surface, and you will be able to see who they really are. I personally had my district leadership position taken away from me for daring to oppose the SGI-USA's unconstitutional and draconian COVID policies publicly, and for exposing their illegal activities in this regard on the internet. But I can only hope the email I sent to the SGI-USA headquarters when the SGI-USA demanded that I upload my personal medical records to the SGI-USA app, that this letter caused them to quickly come to their senses and get rid of this illegal policy. I instead uploaded a picture of myself holding a paper sign on which I wrote, quote, "I have natural immunity and don't need any fake vaccines," end quote. I then used this picture of me holding this sign as my ID to get back into meetings. Luckily, at one of my teaching jobs, I was granted a religious exemption, so I wasn't forced to take this very risky jab, which would have amounted to illegal undue influence. The reason I was granted this religious exemption was because I explained in writing to this employer about both the Eightfold Path and the 5 aggregates in Buddhism. As I explained to my employer, the Eightfold Path includes right action, which includes volitional action. Because my daughter was injured by taking a different vaccine that she was only required to take to study in the U.S., which she wasn't required to take in her first 6 years of life in Japan, had I known about the extreme dangers of all vaccines before she was injured in 2018, I would have never let her take it. My ignorance at the time caused my daughter a lot of unnecessary pain and suffering, which isn't right action in Buddhism. I explained to this employer that Buddhism professes the sanctity of all life, and for me to purposely harm life, whether mine or someone else's, by putting a dangerous substance into my body or into their body, would go against the sanctity of life and would not be considered right action according to Buddhism. The 5 aggregates in Buddhism are form, sensation, perception, volition, and consciousness. I explained to my employer that without volition or the ability to take voluntary action, I cannot claim to be a conscious person, let alone a bodhisattva or a Buddha. I did volunteer to donate my body to science, but not until I die, or so I thought, until I learned when my grandmother died in 2023 at the age of 92, when I presented her dead body to the police and gave them her organ donation papers, organ donation paperwork, where they informed me that you can't donate dead people's organs, which means people who donate their organs are actually euthanized. Therefore, I need to go to the DMV and revoke and rescind my organ donation status. As I learned from many doctors and nurses that a large portion of the people who quote-unquote died in the hospitals during the COVID coup were actually euthanized to gain enormous profits on harvesting their organs. How can anyone be a conscious person if they don't even have volition over what happens to their bodies or what goes into their body? when I just asked the AI on my phone what Daisaku Ikeda has said about volition, this is a couple of the many responses it gave to me. Quote, Ikeda highlights volition as the link between perception and action, encompassing wills, wants, and desires. End quote. And, quote, he suggests that a fundamental revolution in the life of a single individual, fueled by volition, can foster the kind of consciousness and solidarity that liberates humanity from cycles of warfare and violence, end quote. It's sad when AI is becoming more conscious than the leaders of SGI-USA and SUA who initiated the anti-human and anti-conscious COVID policies. So when the SGI-USA started illegally, unduly influencing its members into taking part in this illegal and very dangerous medical experiment, I started a Facebook group called Sokogakai Members for Bodily Autonomy. This is when I reestablished my self on the sites under a fake name, which I'm still under now. Okay, so I created the site, Sokogakai Members for Bodily Autonomy. Though Facebook shadow bans everything I post now, and even worse during the COVID coup, I was happy that a few other SGI members were somehow able to find the group and join it. So we were finally able to have the dialogue that SGI-USA leaders refused to have with its members and its frontline leaders. It was shortly after this that 3 men's leaders from San Diego came to home visit me to inform me that my district was being combined with another district and that I would no longer be a leader. In the home visit, they asked me to take down this group from Facebook. My response was identical to Nichiren Daishonen's response in the Risho on Kokoran, when he says if wise people are able to convince him that his points of view are incorrect, he would be happy to adopt another point of view. So far, 2 years later, and no one has been willing to have a dialogue with me to change my points of view on this subject. Therefore, instead of taking down this group, as they asked, I created another group on Facebook called Soka University Alumni and Students for Bodily Autonomy. Not until after Lucas's tragic passing at SUA did the Alumni Association of SUA finally had 3 members have a Zoom dialogue with me. In my dialogue with these 3 members of the Alumni Association, I was able to surmise that Lucas was not given any medical exemption from taking part in this medical experiment, even though it was known that he already had a heart condition. However, they believed he didn't take a COVID jab directly at the behest of Soka University of America because in 2021, when this experimental product was first introduced, he wasn't yet a student at SUA. In fact, he entered SUA in the fall of 2023, and by then SUA had dropped its mandates requiring all students to be quote-unquote vaccinated. However, when he was applying to go to SUA in 2022, SUA was still requiring students to get jabbed. In addition, it's safe to surmise that the Brazilian SGI, to which he and his family were longtime members, was promoting this dangerous product to members, as both SGI and SGI-USA were. Therefore, if Lucas was in any way unduly coerced or unduly influenced by either SUA or SGI Brazil to comply with this medical experiment, we would have to conclude, as harsh as it might sound, that either or both SUA and SGI Brazil were partially responsible for Lucas's untimely murder. This flu, called SARS-CoV-2, had an over 99% survivability rate for young men like Lucas. He did not need to take this very risky so-called vaccine, nor did any other student at SUA, who were all illegally mandated to do so by SUA. I think it is obvious now to any somewhat aware or educated person that both SGI-USA and SUA were wrong for expecting members and students to blindly take this experimental product, which has turned out to be so deadly and to have so many grave side effects. According to Pfizer's own trial documents, it has a negative 400% efficacy, as I said before, meaning, as I said before, you have to kill 4 people in order to save one person's life with this so-called vaccine. Which many respectable medical professionals are now rightly calling a bioweapon. If you ask Grok or Meta AI now, who was in charge of bioweapons development in the U.S. from the late 1980s to 2022, and it will tell you Anthony Fauci was the #1 person in charge of bioweapons development. And to think people would ignorantly take health advice from this person. After this home visit that stripped me of my district leadership responsibilities, SGI-USA finally started to allow in-person meetings again. And I learned at the time from my previous women's co-district leader that not only did she now have cancer, but 7 other members of our SGI chapter in San Diego also contracted cancer during this whole debacle. In all my 50-plus years in the SGI-USA, formerly called NSA, and the 13 years I practiced in Japan, never have I ever been in one SGI chapter that had more than 1 person at any given time that had cancer. I'm not sure if all 8 people who now had cancer in my chapter all donated their bodies to mad scientists and took part in this deadly medical experiment, or if it was only SGI-USA's illegal undue influence which prompted them to do so, but it is safe to surmise that this is the case for the majority of these individuals. So what can we do now to try to rectify this tragic situation? When are we going to have an open dialogue about this atrocity? If you have the guts to read the 2-volume book, The Pfizer Trial Documents, Pfizer's Crimes Against Humanity, edited by best-selling author and Rhodes Scholar Dr. Naomi Wolf, along with Amy Kelly, where they had medical doctors, scientists, nurses, and medical trial analysts and researchers sift through the thousands of pages of documents that Pfizer submitted to the FDA to get their approval to use this supposed vaccine with an emergency use authorization, EUA. Again, the FDA fought a FOIA Freedom of Information Act request to keep all these documents from the public for 75 years. Fortunately, the FDA lost the court battle and had to release them all to the public. In these two voluminous tomes, you will find, as I said before, that not only did Pfizer and the FDA know that this experimental product would greatly increase heart conditions, especially in young men, and cancer risks to everyone who took it, but it would also drastically decrease a woman's chance of getting pregnant and or of having a healthy baby, a healthy childbirth, if she was able to get pregnant. We have now seen the deadly effects of this product worldwide since it was first introduced. Across the board, sudden deaths have gone up. If you watch the shocking documentary, Died Suddenly, you will see that Lucas's death is not an anomaly. Even though Lucas had a pre-existing heart condition, there have been so many young men who were previously perfectly healthy who all of a sudden collapsed and died while playing sports shortly after taking one of these mRNA lipid nanoparticle spike protein cocktails falsely called vaccines. Childbirth statistics in many countries have shown a drastic decrease in childbirth after they introduced this deadly product. In addition, turbo cancers have been affecting young and old people alike. So many of the youth of SGI come from the members having babies. Many of them are students at SUA or were students at SUA over the last 20 years. Are we going to see a decline in the amount of youths in SGI along with the plummeting birth rates around the world? When are we going to have any accountability? Who in the SGI-USA were responsible for this deadly action of practicing medicine without a license? Did any of them know it is illegal to implore others to take part in medical experiments without a medical license? When I learned in 2021 that SGI-USA was pushing this medical experiment on the members, I wrote on my Facebook page that this was far worse than when the Nichiren Shoshu priesthood required its members to enshrine the Shinto talisman in their homes during World War II. This talisman, the COVID jab, pushed by the high priest of the cult of pharmacology, Anthony Fauci, who needed a presidential pardon to shield him from all of his crimes, was far more deadly and had far graver consequences than someone enshrining some benign relic of some ancient religion. Shinto was a much more benign religion than the cult of scientism as pushed by the criminal high priest Anthony Fauci. Ever since the robber baron John D. Rockefeller bastardized all healing arts with his toxic petroleum-based petrochemical poisons falsely called medicines, the number 3 cause of deaths in the U.S. has become prescription drugs. And many people who have thoroughly studied this issue, like me, and other doctors I watch their podcasts, say the number 1 and number 2 causes of deaths in the U.S., which is heart disease and cancer, are most likely linked to overuse of prescription drugs and the ever-increasing vaccine schedule. I was very fortunate that in the 13 years that I lived in Japan from 2004 to 2017, anytime I went to a doctor and he or she prescribed me any Western pharmaceutical product, I would always tell him or her that I don't take allopathic Western medicines. So he or she would have to grudgingly prescribe me the natural homeopathic alternative herbal Chinese medicine that in Japan they call Kompo, that didn't give the doctor any bonus kickbacks from the pharmacy. When I went to my 20-year SUA first class reunion in July of 2025, I wasn't surprised that at age 54, I looked as young as, or younger than most of my 2005 classmates who were all in their late 30s or early 40s. When I graduated in 2005, even though I was about 12 to 13 years older than almost all my classmates, I looked the same age as they did. This is because since I was in my teens in the 1980s, I have always been into exercise, healthy diet, and natural homeopathic medicines. In addition, we were only required to take 2 or 3 vaccines in the 1970s when I was growing up, and I have never in my life ever taken any flu shots. Before the pandemic, the average teenager was required to take up to 70 plus vaccines and or boosters. Now, since the pandemic, the childhood vaccine schedule has increased to over 100 shots required from birth until graduation of high school. This cannot be healthy for any child to be putting this many poisons into their systems. The time is now for not only a dialogue about this tragic episode in SUA's and SGI-USA's history. However, we must also have an education program to teach all those who took part in this extremely dangerous medical experiment on how to get rid of the spike protein and the self-assembling lipid nanoparticles, in addition to the simian virus 40 or SV40, which has been found in the Pfizer COVID vaccines and boosters. Many researchers are realizing that this SV40, simian virus 40, is the main cause of the skyrocketing turbo cancers. Many people are getting shortly after taking this so-called vaccine. We must begin teaching victims of this medical experiment how to repair their destroyed immune systems so we don't have any more people die suddenly like Lucas did. Across the U.S., morticians and embalmers have been reporting an alarming new phenomenon never before witnessed. That has only been seen since the COVID vaccines were introduced. They have seen long calamari-like growths in the veins and arteries of dead people, which now makes it next to impossible to embalm a dead person's body until they pull out these long, white, fibrous growths from their veins and arteries. I wouldn't be surprised if what stopped Lucas's heart was one of these calamari-like white blood clots, not his pre-existing heart condition. All humans are prone to making mistakes, as I was with letting my daughter take a vaccine she really didn't need in 2018. If the SGI-USA leaders and whoever was responsible at SUA for unduly coercing and unduly influencing people into taking part in this deadly medical experiment do not by now realize the extreme folly of their tragic mistakes, and if they are not now willing to do all they can to rectify and make whole all those who were harmed, should they still be allowed to continue in their leadership positions? A true sign of a leader, as Daisaku Ikeda has said for decades, is someone who can see when they have made a mistake and quickly take corrective actions to rectify the mistakes they've made. There are many doctors and natural healers who have been working tirelessly to come up with natural products to try to chelate or expunge all the toxic substances that were contained in the modified RNA lipid nanoparticle shots, including the SV40, which was put in the Pfizer jab, which they knew would increase cancer cases. In addition, the deadly spike protein has been able to cross the blood-brain barrier and get into every part of a person's body, including into their unborn fetus or fetuses. This extremely toxic substance can be removed from victims' bodies with certain chelation products. However, time is of the essence. A group of people at both SUA and in the SGI-USA who don't have a conflict of interest should be assembled to study possibilities of how to remedy all the harms that have been inflicted on SGI-USA members and members of the SUA community during the tragic COVID coup. We need to now implement an educational campaign to educate victims of SGI-USA's and SUA's tragic COVID policies. And there is no time to waste in this endeavor. There are many smart graduates of SUA and other universities who are good at research, or anyone else who's just good at research who didn't graduate from a university, who can help in this important undertaking. If we don't want to see more untimely deaths like Lucas Colombo Ferrari's at SUA, and we don't want more skyrocketing cancer cases like the 8 people in my SGI-USA chapter in San Diego, we have to act now. If I can help out in any way in this endeavor, please don't hesitate to contact me. In closing, I would like to share one of the quotes I highlighted in my first volume of my 3 volumes of my selected writings from Soka University of America, published by Second American Renaissance Press, from Daisaku Ikeda, from the published dialogue he had with futurist Hazel Henderson. He said, quote, "Strong language that censures and combats a great evil often awakens adverse reaction from society, but this must not intimidate those who believe they are right. The lion is a lion because he roars," end quote. That's from page 40. Sincerely, Timothy Van Kampen Janakis. Thank you for listening. Please help share this. Let's get a dialogue going. Let's get waking the people. If we can stop one person from taking this deadly shot, there's still people stupidly taking their 8th or 9th boosters. If we can just turn on one person to this complete debacle, we can maybe save a few lives and maybe help those who have been harmed because of their ignorance of what was going on during the COVID coup. Thank you guys so much. Take care.